Why avoidants can't handle super empath detachment. Most people think the story ends when the super empath finally walks away. They imagine the silence settles, the distance grows, and both people simply move on with their lives. But what if the most intense part of the story actually begins after the super empath stops fighting for the connection? What if the moment the avoidant appears to get exactly what they wanted, space, freedom, independence, is the exact moment something unexpected starts happening beneath the surface? Because here is the truth that few people talk about. An avoidant can become remarkably comfortable with emotional pursuit. They can become used to knowing that no matter how distant they become, no matter how long they disappear, no matter how many walls they build, there is still someone on the other side trying to understand them, trying to reach them, trying to make the relationship work. And when that person is a super empath, the dynamic becomes even more powerful. So if you've ever wondered why genuine detachment seems to affect avoidance in ways they never expected, stay with me until the end. And while you're here, take a second to subscribe. Not because anyone should chase what doesn't choose them, but because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is learn why certain relationship patterns keep repeating. Now let's get into it. A super empath is often misunderstood. People hear the word empath and immediately picture someone who is endlessly giving, endlessly patient, endlessly forgiving. While there is truth in that image, it misses the most important part. A super empath is not weak. In fact, their strength is often hidden beneath their compassion. They have an extraordinary ability to see beyond someone's defenses. They recognize pain where others see coldness. They notice fear where others see rejection. They are often the people who stay when everyone else leaves. They listen longer, love deeper, and tolerate more uncertainty than most people ever could. But what makes them truly different is that their kindness is not rooted in dependency. It is rooted in choice. They choose to understand, they choose to support, they choose to remain present, and because of that, they often develop incredible emotional endurance. They can survive situations that would make most people give up long ago. They can absorb disappointment after disappointment while still hoping for growth, healing, and connection. Yet beneath all that patience exists something many avoidants fail to recognize. The super empath also possesses a powerful survival instinct. They may stay longer than expected, but they do not stay forever. They may forgive repeatedly, but they do not have infinite tolerance. And when that hidden strength finally awakens, everything changes. For many avoidants, the relationship dynamic eventually becomes familiar territory, not necessarily because they are intentionally manipulating anyone, but because human beings adapt to patterns. If every period of distance is followed by understanding, if every withdrawal is followed by reassurance, if every emotional shutdown is met with patience, a certain expectation quietly develops. The avoidant begins to feel safe inside the cycle. They know someone will reach out. They know someone will try to repair the disconnect. They know someone will continue believing in the relationship even when they themselves feel uncertain. Over time, this creates a strange comfort zone. The avoidant may not consciously think about it, but they begin relying on the emotional consistency of the super empath. Even while resisting intimacy, they benefit from it. Even while pulling away, they depend on the fact that someone remains emotionally invested. The paradox is that many avoidants do not fully appreciate this stability because it becomes normal. Just like people stop noticing the air they breathe, they stop noticing the effort constantly being poured into maintaining the connection, the texts that restart conversations, the emotional labor that resolves conflicts, the understanding that softens misunderstandings, the patience that keeps everything from collapsing. It becomes part of the background, something expected rather than recognized. Without realizing it, the super empath often becomes an invisible emotional safety net. Whenever tension arises, they absorb the shock. Whenever distance appears, they bridge the gap. Whenever uncertainty threatens the relationship, they provide reassurance. This safety net is rarely acknowledged because it operates quietly. It does not demand attention. It simply exists. And that is precisely why it becomes so powerful. The avoidant may continue living their life pursuing distractions, focusing on work, hobbies, responsibilities, or personal goals, all while carrying an unconscious belief that the connection remains available. Even during periods of silence, they often assume the emotional door is still open. They assume that if they decide to return, the bond will still be waiting. This assumption creates a sense of security that is easy to overlook because it feels permanent. But nothing is permanent when only one person is carrying the emotional weight. The super empath may appear endlessly resilient from the outside, yet every disappointment leaves a mark. Every unreciprocated effort creates another crack beneath the surface. Every moment of emotional neglect slowly accumulates. The avoidant rarely sees this process happening because the empath continues showing up. The smiles remain, the conversations continue, the support is still there, Yet beneath that calm exterior, exhaustion is growing. What makes super empathy detachment so shocking is that it almost never happens suddenly. To the avoidant, it can feel as if everything changed overnight. One day the empath is present, engaged, and invested. The next day they seem distant, calm, and emotionally unavailable. But what appears sudden is usually the result of a very long internal journey. Long before the detachment becomes visible, the super empath has been wrestling with difficult truths. They have spent countless nights questioning themselves. They have replayed conversations in their mind. They have searched for solutions. They have adjusted their expectations. They have given second chances, third chances, and often far more than that. Each disappointment adds another layer of emotional fatigue. Each unmet need creates another moment of self-reflection. Eventually, a realization begins to form. They start understanding that love alone cannot sustain a relationship. Effort cannot remain one-sided forever. Compassion cannot replace reciprocity. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the person who once fought for every inch of connection begins redirecting that energy inward. This is the stage most avoidants never notice, because nothing dramatic happens on the surface. There are no grand speeches, no ultimatums, no explosive confrontations. Instead, there is a quiet shift taking place deep within the super empath. The hope that once fueled endless patience starts fading. The emotional investment begins withdrawing. And by the time the detachment becomes visible, the decision has often been forming for months or even years. The avoidant may think they are witnessing the beginning of the story, when in reality they are witnessing the final chapter of a process that has been unfolding in silence all along. The breaking point itself is rarely dramatic. That is one of the biggest misconceptions people have about super empath detachment. They imagine a final argument, a heated confrontation, some explosive moment that marks the end. But more often than not, the breaking point happens in complete silence. It arrives during an ordinary day, hidden inside an ordinary moment. Maybe it happens after another promise goes unfulfilled. Maybe it happens after realizing that every difficult conversation leads back to the same place. Maybe it happens when they finally stop asking themselves how to save the relationship and start asking whether the relationship is saving them. What makes this moment so powerful is that the super empath does not necessarily stop loving. They stop hoping that love alone can change what refuses to change. That distinction matters. The emotions may still exist. The care may still be there. But the belief that their effort will eventually create a different outcome begins to disappear. And once that belief dies, something fundamental shifts. The energy that was once directed outward starts returning home. For the avoidant, this transformation often goes unnoticed because there is no announcement, no warning. The super empath simply becomes quieter, less reactive, less desperate for answers, less willing to carry responsibilities that were never theirs to begin with. What the avoidant does not realize is that they are witnessing the collapse of a dynamic that may have existed for years. The person who once fought tirelessly for connection is no longer fighting. And when the fight disappears, so does the structure that was holding the relationship together. This is why super empath detachment feels completely different from temporary withdrawal. Avoidants have often experienced distance before. They have seen people pull away in frustration. They have witnessed silent treatments, emotional reactions, attempts to provoke guilt, and temporary disappearances designed to get attention. Those situations still contain emotional attachment. The person may be distant physically, but emotionally they remain tethered to the outcome. A super empath's true detachment feels different because it is not fueled by anger. It is not powered by revenge. It is not an attempt to create fear. It is peace, and peace is what makes it so unsettling. The avoidant begins sensing something they cannot easily explain. The usual emotional signals are gone. The urgency has vanished. The pressure has disappeared. The conversations that once carried emotional weight now feel strangely neutral. There is no demand for reassurance, no pursuit, no attempt to force closeness. The super empath is no longer trying to pull the avoidant toward connection. They are simply moving forward. This subtle shift creates a profound psychological impact because genuine detachment cannot be negotiated. It cannot be manipulated. It cannot be controlled. The avoidant may have learned how to navigate conflict, distance, or emotional tension, but authentic emotional release operates according to different rules. For perhaps the first time, they begin realizing that the connection is no longer being maintained on their behalf. As this realization deepens, another uncomfortable truth emerges. The push-pull cycle that once felt predictable starts breaking apart. For years, there may have been an unspoken rhythm to the relationship. Distance would create pursuit, withdrawal would create concern. Silence would eventually be followed by reconnection. Even when the pattern was unhealthy, it was familiar. Human beings often cling to familiar pain because uncertainty feels more threatening than discomfort. But now the pattern stops working. The avoidant pulls away, and nothing happens. They create space, and nobody rushes to close the gap. They become unavailable and discover that someone else has become comfortable with their absence. Suddenly, the relationship no longer follows the script they unconsciously depended on. This loss of predictability creates anxiety that many avoidants struggle to understand. They may tell themselves they wanted more space, yet the space no longer feels comforting. They may insist they value independence, yet something about the new reality feels unsettling. The reason is simple. Independence feels very different when it is chosen versus when it is imposed by genuine emotional detachment. Before, the avoidant could leave knowing the connection remained intact. Now they are confronted with a possibility they never fully considered. What if the person who always stayed has finally accepted the idea of leaving? That question grows louder during the periods of silence that follow. At first, the quiet may feel familiar. Avoidants are often accustomed to distance. They may even welcome it initially. But over time, the silence begins changing shape. It stops feeling like freedom and starts feeling like absence. The messages that once appeared are no longer arriving. The emotional presence that once existed in the background is gone. The support that seemed permanent is nowhere to be found. And this is where something fascinating happens psychologically. Human beings are often most aware of something after it disappears. We notice the warmth of sunlight when clouds arrive. We appreciate health after illness. We recognize value after loss. The same principle applies here. The avoidant begins hearing the silence in ways they never heard the words. Every unanswered moment becomes a reminder that someone who once invested deeply is no longer investing. Every empty space becomes evidence that the relationship has fundamentally changed. The absence starts speaking louder than any argument ever could. And because there is no conflict to focus on, no emotional drama to distract from the truth, the avoidant is left alone with their thoughts. For many, that becomes the beginning of a much deeper internal process. What makes this stage even more powerful is the role scarcity plays in human psychology. People often underestimate how much certainty shapes perception. As long as something feels available, it is easy to postpone appreciation. It is easy to assume there will always be another opportunity, another conversation, another chance to reconnect later. The super empath's presence may have felt permanent simply because it lasted through so many disappointments. But genuine detachment changes the equation completely. Suddenly, the avoidant is no longer dealing with guaranteed availability. They are confronting uncertainty. And uncertainty has a way of bringing hidden emotions to the surface. Feelings that were buried beneath distractions begin emerging. Thoughts that were previously ignored demand attention. The avoidant may find themselves remembering conversations, gestures, moments of support, and acts of understanding they barely acknowledged at the time. Not because the super empath has become more valuable than before, but because the illusion of permanence has disappeared. What was once taken for granted is now viewed through the lens of potential loss. And loss has a remarkable ability to reveal emotional truths that comfort often keeps hidden. The deeper irony is that the super empath is usually not trying to create this reaction. They are simply reclaiming themselves. Yet in doing so, they force the avoidant to confront something they may have spent years avoiding. The realization that some people do not leave because they stop caring. They leave because they finally start caring about themselves enough to walk away. That realization marks the beginning of an internal conflict that many avoidants never expected to face. For a long time, their primary struggle may have revolved around maintaining distance, preserving autonomy, and protecting themselves from vulnerability. The challenge was always how to avoid feeling overwhelmed by intimacy. But now a different battle emerges. For perhaps the first time, they are not wrestling with closeness. They are wrestling with absence. Part of them still craves the safety of emotional independence, yet another part begins noticing an emptiness that independence alone cannot fill. This contradiction can feel deeply confusing because it forces them into unfamiliar emotional territory. They may tell themselves they are fine, that nothing has changed, that life is continuing exactly as before. Yet certain moments begin slipping through the cracks of those explanations. A memory surfaces unexpectedly. A familiar place triggers a thought. A quiet evening creates space for reflection that distractions can no longer fully suppress. And in those moments, the avoidant starts experiencing something they spent years avoiding, the emotional weight of what the relationship actually meant. The more they try to simplify it, the more complicated it becomes. Because they are no longer evaluating the connection through the lens of pressure or expectation. They are evaluating it through the lens of loss. And loss has a way of revealing emotional truths that remain hidden when someone is still standing beside you. As this conflict deepens, memories begin taking on a life of their own. What once seemed ordinary now feels significant. Conversations that felt routine suddenly carry emotional meaning. Small acts of support that barely registered at the time now appear extraordinary in hindsight. This is one of the most powerful effects of genuine detachment. It removes the distractions that once prevented deeper appreciation. While the relationship was active, attention may have been focused on fears, obligations, uncertainties, or the discomfort of emotional closeness. But once the connection becomes unavailable, the mind starts reorganizing its priorities. It begins revisiting experiences from a different perspective. The avoidant remembers who consistently showed up during difficult times. They remember who tried to understand rather than judge. They remember the patience, the effort, the emotional generosity that quietly existed in the background for so long. And because these memories arrive without the tension that once surrounded the relationship, they often feel clearer than before. The avoidant starts seeing the connection not as a collection of problems, but as a collection of moments that held genuine value. This process can be surprisingly painful because hindsight often reveals things that presence concealed. The very qualities that once felt easy to overlook now become impossible to ignore. The super empath's absence turns old memories into emotional mirrors, reflecting truths that had been hidden in plain sight. Eventually, those reflections lead to an even more uncomfortable discovery. The avoidant begins recognizing just how much of the relationship was being carried by the super empath. This realization rarely arrives all at once. It unfolds gradually, layer by layer. At first, they notice the missing conversations. Then they notice the missing emotional support. Then they begin noticing the countless invisible efforts they never fully acknowledged. The relationship did not maintain itself. The connection did not survive difficult periods on its own. Someone was constantly investing energy into preserving it. Someone was initiating discussions, repairing misunderstandings, creating opportunities for closeness, and holding space for emotional growth. What once appeared effortless is suddenly revealed as the result of tremendous emotional labor. This realization can be profoundly humbling because it challenges assumptions the avoidant may have carried for years. They may have believed the relationship would always exist in some form. They may have assumed the bond was naturally resilient. They may have mistaken the super empath's commitment for permanence. But now they begin understanding that what felt permanent was actually being actively sustained. And once that effort disappeared, the reality of the situation became impossible to ignore. The relationship was not standing on an unshakable foundation. It was standing on the shoulders of someone who loved deeply enough to keep carrying it long after it became heavy. This awareness often opens the door to regret, but regret itself does not arrive in a single wave. It comes in layers. The first layer is often the easiest to recognize. The avoidant misses the attention. They miss the consistency. They miss knowing someone cared. But deeper layers soon follow. They begin regretting moments they dismissed too quickly, opportunities they failed to appreciate, conversations they avoided, vulnerabilities they never expressed. The regret evolves from missing what they received to understanding what they failed to give. And that distinction changes everything. Because now the focus is no longer on what was lost. The focus shifts toward what could have been created if different choices had been made. This is where the emotional weight becomes much heavier. Missing someone's presence is painful. Realizing you contributed to their departure is something else entirely. It forces accountability. It forces self-reflection. It forces a person to confront versions of themselves they may have spent years avoiding. The avoidant begins asking questions that cannot be answered by distance alone. Why did they keep pushing away someone who genuinely cared? Why did they wait until the connection was fading before recognizing its value? Why did fear feel safer than vulnerability? These questions do not always have immediate answers, but once they emerge, they are difficult to silence. They linger beneath the surface, reshaping how the avoidant views both the relationship and themselves. For some avoidants, this growing awareness eventually creates an urge they never expected to feel. The urge to reach out, to reconnect, to test whether the door is still open. From the outside, this can seem sudden. Friends, family, and even the super empath may be surprised when communication unexpectedly resumes after a long period of silence. But internally, the decision is often the result of a lengthy emotional process. The avoidant has spent weeks, months, or even longer confronting thoughts they once ignored. They have wrestled with memories, regrets, and unanswered questions, and eventually curiosity begins blending with longing. Yet it is important to understand that not every attempt to reconnect comes from the same place. Sometimes the motivation is loneliness. Sometimes it is discomfort with change. Sometimes it is fear of losing access to someone who once provided emotional security. But in other cases, something more significant is happening. The avoidant is beginning to awaken emotionally. They are starting to recognize patterns that previously operated outside their awareness. They are becoming conscious of the walls they built and the consequences those walls created. Whether this awakening leads to genuine growth depends on what happens next. But one thing is certain, the super empath's detachment has already accomplished something powerful. It has forced the avoidant to stop running long enough to see what was standing behind them all along. And once that vision becomes clear, the story enters an entirely new chapter, one where the super empath is no longer the same person they once were. What makes this next chapter so difficult for the avoidant to understand is that the super empath who emerges from genuine detachment is often almost unrecognizable. Not because they have become cold, bitter, or resentful, but because they have become centered. For years, so much of their emotional energy may have been directed toward understanding someone else, helping someone else, waiting for someone else, hoping for someone else. Now that energy has returned to its source. The super empath begins investing in their own healing, their own peace, their own future. They start creating a life that no longer revolves around whether another person chooses closeness or distance. Their happiness becomes less dependent on external validation and more rooted in internal stability. This transformation is subtle at first, but eventually it becomes impossible to miss. The emotional urgency that once defined them disappears. The need for answers fades. The desire to convince someone of their worth evaporates. They stop chasing explanations because they no longer require them to move forward. And perhaps most importantly, they stop abandoning themselves in order to preserve a connection. To the avoidant, this change can feel startling. The person who once seemed endlessly available now has boundaries. The person who once tolerated inconsistency now values consistency. The person who once prioritized the relationship above everything else now prioritizes self-respect. The irony is that many avoidants find this version of the super empath even more attractive than before. But attraction alone cannot rewind time, because the transformation was earned through pain, growth, and lessons that cannot simply be undone. As a result, many of the old dynamics that once worked effortlessly begin failing. The occasional message designed to test the waters no longer creates the same reaction. Small breadcrumbs that once inspired hope are met with calm neutrality. Mixed signals lose their influence. Emotional ambiguity loses its power. The detached super empath is no longer responding from a place of longing. They are responding from a place of clarity. This is often one of the most frustrating stages for avoidants because it forces them to confront a reality they have never experienced before. The relationship no longer operates according to familiar rules. They may attempt to recreate old patterns, only to discover those patterns have nowhere to attach themselves. The super empath is no longer filling in the gaps, no longer interpreting inconsistency as potential, no longer mistaking temporary effort for lasting change. Every interaction is filtered through a new lens, one shaped by experience rather than hope. This does not mean the super empath has become cynical. It means they have become discerning. They have learned the difference between promises and patterns, between intentions and actions, between someone missing them and someone being ready for a healthy relationship. For the avoidant, this can feel like losing access to a version of the connection that once felt guaranteed. The safety net is gone. The emotional cushion is gone. What remains is accountability. And accountability is far more difficult to navigate than avoidance. That is why true detachment often forces avoidants to confront their deepest fears. Many people assume the avoidant's greatest fear is commitment, but beneath commitment usually lies something much deeper. Fear of vulnerability, fear of dependence, fear of rejection, fear of discovering that if they fully invest emotionally, they could still end up hurt. These fears often operate silently for years, influencing behavior without ever being directly addressed. Distance becomes a form of protection. Emotional walls become a form of control. Detachment becomes a strategy for avoiding potential pain. But when the super empath truly leaves, those defenses can no longer hide the underlying wounds. Suddenly, the avoidant is standing face to face with the very emotions they spent years trying to outrun. They are forced to consider whether their protective strategies actually protected them or merely isolated them. They are forced to ask whether avoiding vulnerability saved them from pain or prevented them from experiencing deeper connection. These questions can be uncomfortable, even overwhelming, because they challenge long-held beliefs about safety and survival. Yet this confrontation also contains the possibility of growth. For some avoidants, it becomes a turning point. The moment they begin recognizing that emotional security does not come from avoiding intimacy. It comes from learning how to participate in it without losing themselves. Of course, one question naturally emerges from all of this. Can the relationship ever be rebuilt? The answer is more complicated than many people want it to be. Reconciliation is possible, but not because someone misses the past, not because loneliness creates temporary motivation, not because fear of loss suddenly appears. A healthy reunion requires something far deeper. It requires transformation. The avoidant must become willing to examine the patterns that contributed to the disconnection. They must learn how to communicate differently, show up differently, and engage emotionally in ways they may have avoided before. At the same time, the super empath must remain committed to the growth they achieved through detachment. They cannot return to abandoning themselves. They cannot sacrifice boundaries for the sake of familiarity. They cannot carry the relationship alone simply because they once did. In other words, the old relationship cannot be rebuilt. Only a new one can be created. One based on mutual effort rather than one-sided endurance. One based on emotional responsibility rather than emotional dependency. One based on consistency rather than uncertainty. Without these changes, reconciliation becomes little more than a temporary return to old patterns. But with genuine growth, something different becomes possible. Not a recreation of the past, but the creation of something healthier than the past ever